Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Accelerate to Net Zero. This event, specifically for the UK and Europe, is the final in a global event series we've been hosting at the Carbon Trust. We've had events in Mexico, South Africa, and Southeast Asia now, all focused on the critical topic of turning corporate ambition into concrete climate action. So, in today's event, we really want to focus on the challenges and solutions specifically for businesses in the UK and Europe. We know that, of course, there is new regulation in the EU in the form of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and there's growing momentum on transition planning in the UK, thanks to the UK's Transition Plan Task Force. And these are all making climate action and, of course, reporting a growing focus for businesses in the UK and Europe. So, in this morning's plenary session and then in the sector stages later on, what we really want to do is delve deep into the topic of transition planning and how organisations can create a really robust plan to transition to net zero and shift their business models at speed and scale. I'm very pleased to be hosting this morning's plenary session. My name is Nina Foster. I am Senior Manager in the Carbon Trust's Net Zero Intelligence Unit. I hope you have everything that you need to have a lovely morning with us, that you have a cup of coffee or maybe a cup of tea if you're a Brit. So for the first hour of today's session, we're going to be in plenary all here together. And before I introduce some of the excellent speakers that we have lined up for you, I wanted to briefly outline how the second half of the event is going to run, because it's at that point that you have some choices to make. So after the plenary session, we're going to ask you to move into sector-specific stages. We have 3 stages: agriculture, food and drink, manufacturing, and infrastructure. And in these stages, Carbon Trust experts are going to deep dive into the specific challenges and solutions for these sectors. You can see there we've got an excellent lineup of speakers and experts from businesses across the UK and Europe as well. Now, if you don't feel that any of these sector stages matches your sector specifically, please just feel free to choose one that feels the most relevant to you. We feel that many of the challenges and solutions that will be discussed within these stages can be applicable across sectors. So I think you'll still gain some really tangible actions from the rich discussions in those sector stages. In terms of accessing the stages, you'll be able to access them through the programme page of Eventi, which is what you use to get here to this plenary session. So you should hopefully find it quite easy to navigate to those stages. And you can even switch between the stages throughout if you want to learn from others. So I have a few brief housekeeping pointers before we get into the good stuff. We are virtual here today, but we're using a really great platform that facilitates lots of interactivity. So please do take advantage of this by interacting with the polls and the questions and any other prompts that we have for you. If you have any issues with the technology or use of the platform at any point, please just write in the chat, or you could contact us at events@carbontrust.com. We have a team behind the scenes who are troubleshooting, so you should be able to get help quite quickly. If you need translations throughout the session at all, please click on the link below the video stream, where you'll be able to access translations throughout the session. Now, I believe you've already been prompted to participate in a poll, and we want to get to know a little bit more about who has joined us here today. We've asked you where you are joining us from, so let's have a little look at the results of that poll now. So we have many people joining us from England. That's where I'm joining you from today as well. I'm joining you from London. And we have a really good representation of Scots and also people joining from across Europe, Northern, Western, and even a few from the rest of the world, which is great to see too. I'm not Irish, so very pleased to see a 1% representation of Ireland there as well. And it's not just personal. We know that, of course, the net zero transition is going to require a huge amount of collaboration across borders. So we think it's really important that we're bringing together lots of different organisations from lots of different parts of the UK and Europe here today. So now that we know a little bit more about you, I think it's time to learn a little bit more about the Carbon Trust and the very important topic that we will be addressing here today. I'm going to introduce you now to Chris Stark. He has recently joined us as the Carbon Trust's new CEO, having just spent 6 years as Chief Executive of the UK's Climate Change Committee. He's a world-renowned climate policy expert, and I'm sure you're all as excited as I am to hear what he's got to say to us this morning. So, Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Nina. That was very generous of you. And hello to everyone who's joining us online today. I think this is the biggest online event that we will host this year at Carbon Trust. So I'm very pleased to be here. And it's a special one for me because I'm in week 3.5 of my new role here in the Carbon Trust. And I'm loving it. So I'm going to tell you a bit about that today. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Stark. I am the new CEO here at the Carbon Trust. I joined Carbon Trust after, just as Nina said, just over 6 years as the UK's Chief Climate Advisor in the UK Climate Change Committee, and chose my next role very carefully. So this is a really important organisation to me, and I think it's a really important organisation to you too, if we can pitch ourselves well. So let me tell you a bit about that today. This morning, I want to really do 3 things. So firstly, I do want to talk about the situation we face on climate. And I'm certain that other speakers this morning will cover that too. But this is a really important time for us to get serious about acting on climate and acting on the transition ahead for us. Secondly, I do want to say something about why I've taken on this role and how I see Carbon Trust itself developing its role with me here. And thirdly, probably more interesting than all of that, is how I see your role as the audience today in this transition, and particularly my sense of what I think the priorities need to be for the private sector, for businesses. So perhaps we'll explore a little of some of that today before we go into more depth later on with later speakers. So let's just start with climate, shall we? And let's just talk about why this is such an important moment. We are in the midst of an incredible period of heat, driven, of course, by climate change itself. 2023 was the hottest year on record. There's a very good chance 2024 will beat that. Those records continue to be broken. We're seeing extreme weather throughout the world. It's an extremely soggy day today in London. Thankfully, not such an extreme weather, but everywhere you look now, we are seeing the impacts of climate change. This is an El Nino period, so we would expect high temperatures. Nevertheless, the sort of extremes that we're seeing are still pretty shocking, but they're not shocking if we step back a little and just look at the overall trend here. It is, I'm afraid, inevitable that as we accumulate greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we see these kind of impacts. That's because of our use of fossil fuels globally, and it's also because of how we're using land and driving agricultural practices to cause this problem. So we shouldn't really be shocked, but we should be worried when scientists tell us, as they have been telling us, that some of the impacts we've seen, particularly in the last 18 months or so, are racing ahead of where the models say we should be. And yet, despite all of that, despite the empirical evidence all around us that climate change is now with us, despite that scientific consensus which grows stronger every year, and despite the fact that everything says we really do need to reach a global goal of net zero, we are sadly in the midst of what I think you can call a backlash, at least a political backlash against net zero as a slogan, at least. And I think even more troubling than that, in some parts of the world, some shareholder-led concern over the impact of net zero policies at the corporate level, or ESG policies more generally. So you're going to hear from my friend Laura Clark in just a minute. She's the CEO of Climate Earth, and I'm very, very grateful for her joining us today from Madrid. But let me tell you, Laura is not short of material for litigation at the moment with corporates and with governments around the world. Which brings me to the second of my themes this morning. Amidst all of this, why have I joined Carbon Trust? And it's quite a simple answer to that. I think that the recent phase of enthusiasm for net zero was tremendously exciting and tremendously necessary. My own contribution to that was here in the UK to lead the UK analysis programme that led to the UK setting a net zero target into law. That was the first anywhere in the world. But what comes next is far more interesting. It's also far harder and it's far more worthwhile. We need to actually deliver on achieving net zero. And I think that is going to have to be led by the private sector. So my move to Carbon Trust is about moving to a very unique organization that has really been a pioneer in this space. We are unique in many ways. We are a non-profit. All the money we make goes back into our mission of addressing climate change and cutting carbon. And we take a global outlook on that. We have people and offices around the world. And we specialize, this is probably more interesting than anything, we specialize in advising in a pretty unique space between business and government, that sort of amorphous sandwich between there. We face both ways into that. So Carbon Trust for me is a really unique organization. I'm delighted to be here. Let me now say something controversial about my views on net zero itself. I care deeply about the achievement of net zero, as you would expect. That global goal of net zero for carbon dioxide is very simply the point when we stop warming the planet. But I am much, much more driven by the short term than I am by the mid-century. So what we do in the next 5 to 10 years is much more important for the climate than where we'd like to be by the middle of this century. So my pitch to you is the same one that I made to the board of Carbon Trust when I pitched for this job, which is that we need to be one of the actors in this space that really leads the change towards genuine transition plans towards that goal, framing this as a transition, a genuine transition that will change over time and will feel different depending which bit of the economy you're in and which part of the world you're in. That needs to be managed with plans that are aligned with what we need to do overall to hit net zero globally. And that probably means not achieving it at the corporate level in the short term. Those transition plans are really important to me. So the transition plans have within them the footprints that we'll do, the target setting that is aligned with the science, of course, across the whole supply chain with best-in-class methodology and genuine ambition through all of that. Transition planning that does that is very, very important. And we also need to look to the other issue in climate change, which is climate change itself. When we think about transition planning, we need to be planning for the impacts of climate change alongside the challenge of decarbonising across the supply chain. So all of that is tremendously stimulating, quite difficult, and I'm sure those of you on the call this morning have already encountered many of these issues. But my first priority at Carbon Trust is to become genuinely expert in transition planning. We are already an organisation that does this well. I'd like us to do that even better. That requires an organisation that is hugely well informed on those challenges as I've described them. But secondly, we do a bit more than that in Carbon Trust. Unashamedly, we are also invested in accelerating that transition in those areas where we have expertise. You're going to hear about some of those later on today. That extends into building greater influence, I think, over the policy process around the world. Policymakers and government need to hear what makes good transition planning work and how we can accelerate this transition. And thirdly, if I'm right in all that, and if Carbon Trust is going to be the kind of high integrity advisor and all of this on that transition, then we also need to have high impact in the evidence that we produce as an organization. We need to lead this discussion as much as we can more actively. So that means Carbon Trust publishing original analysis, original evidence, supporting your own transition with a far better set of informed insights about what is actually needed across this transition towards net zero. So that's what you can expect from Carbon Trust under my leadership. I hope it sounds exciting. I've been making the same points to my team internally over the last few weeks. Let me just close before we move to Laura with just a few thoughts to set us up for the rest of the day on what your role is in this transition. And the first thing to say is, of course, we need lots and lots of collaboration to make this work, lots of information to make decarbonisation work through the supply chain and genuine decarbonisation. That extends, I think, to collaborating within sectors. finding solutions that will help accelerate that transition. And I'd like to see Carbon Trust help with that as much as we can. Your boards and your shareholders will very soon see good transition planning based on solid evidence as a really essential strategic concern for them. At least that's my hope. So this is really, for me at least, about more than just disclosing things under a new framework or new accounting standards. This is about genuine transition planning, which is a strategic discussion, and that needs capacity to think that sort of thing through at board level, and it also needs a solid set of tools and solid data to do it well. Finance has got to be there, and we will cover some of that today. We also need, of course, a well-aligned banking and investment community, and I think the challenge is there for them. And we also need to see consumers and people demanding more on climate. They are already doing so, but we're not giving them the right tools to do that yet. So there's another piece, I think, on how the consumer can be enabled to make good choices with meaningful labeling, about low carbon choices, also the high carbon choices. Again, this is something I think Carbon Trust can really help with. And lastly, from me this morning, in terms of what you can do, we absolutely need strong champions in business for decarbonisation, strong champions across the private sector. If this is done well, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. So we don't want to see greenwashing. I'm afraid we are seeing some evidence of that recently. We don't want paper decarbonisation. We don't want poor quality offsetting. And we definitely don't want to see one of the most interesting and I think difficult trends that we've seen recently, which is what I've been calling recently green hushing, which is sort of doing the job, but not talking about it because of that shareholder revolt or the political backlash that we've seen here. We should all be proud that we are tackling this thing together in a high integrity way. So if we do that, hopefully Carbon Trust is an organisation that can lead some of that. And I hope that sounds exciting. That's what I'm here to do. And it's certainly keeping me awake at night. So very, very good to see you all. Back to Nina.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a really excellent scene-setting talk and reminder of the urgency of all of this and the importance of near-term action in transition planning. Very excited now to be introducing you to our next speaker. She is our keynote speaker for the day, Laura Clark. She is the CEO of Client Earth, a legal environmental charity. She joined Client Earth in September 2022 after 2 decades in public policy, including diplomatic roles across Africa, Asia, and Europe. We invited Laura to speak at the event to really amplify the significance of the risk of inaction. And so it's with that in mind that I'm very pleased to be welcoming her to the stage. Joining us from Madrid today, please welcome Laura Clark, OBE.
Thank you very much, Nina, and thank you, Chris, for the invitation and the warm welcome, and huge congratulations on your new role. I'm looking forward to seeing what you do with it, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'll start, if I can, with a bit of an anecdote. I had the great misfortune, the great bad luck early on in my leadership journey in the Foreign Office of having a deputy who was absolutely brilliant. So I would like set this big picture vision, and she would go off and make it happen. She could operationalize and resource a strategy. She could stand up a crisis team at the drop of a hat, you name it. So I went along thinking what leadership was a walk in the park. And it wasn't until later that I realized quite how hard it is normally when you don't have someone so brilliant to turn a strategic intent into reality, how you need the right wiring, the right levers, the right incentives and culture and processes and ways of working. And so that's true in normal leadership. It's even more true in the climate world. And both governments and corporates are really good at making commitments and less good at the follow through because it is really hard. So how do we, as the Carbon Trust puts it on its front page, how do we turn climate ambition into impact? How do we move from targets to robust action and bridge that corporate climate gap? So I'm going to start with a snapshot of where I think we've got to on corporate climate action. I'll reinforce the business case for why it's so important, really underlining the risk element. And then I'll talk about the role that the law can play as part of a wider movement in bridging the climate gap. So where are we now? Well, 9 years on from Paris, and Paris and the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees cemented the idea that we should be setting 2050 net zero targets. And by 2022, 91% of the global economy was covered by some sort of net zero pledge. Now, that includes swathes of the corporate world, largely on a voluntary basis. So the problem is not the quantity of pledges, it's the quality. And now Chris touched on this. So for lots of companies, pledges have not been backed by robust transition plans that are anchored really at the heart of the organization. Instead, they've been PR exercises. Most have not set those medium-term 2030 emissions targets as required by the science. Now, we know we need to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. And many corporates are over-relying on the net in net zero, with speculative or opaque offsets assigned to do most of the heavy lifting. So the plans are largely not up to scratch. And I think that's partly because of an inadequate understanding of the climate risk that companies are actually exposed to. A PwC survey of CEOs earlier this year found that only 45% of companies have made real strides in incorporating climate risk into their financial planning, and even fewer do the same for biodiversity risk. So to be clear, when I say climate risk, what are we talking about? We're talking about three main elements. Firstly, the physical risk to businesses and their assets from floods, heat waves, other climate-generated extreme weather. Secondly, the regulatory and market changes that will leave emissions-intensive business models unfeasible. And thirdly, it's where organizations like Client Earth come in, the growing legal and reputational risks of failing to transition. So a proper understanding of and management of climate risk and proper transition planning is critical for a company's long-term commercial viability. It's not good PR, it's good business. And climate needs to be brought into top-level planning now to get a head start on the economies of the future, and because of the very real risks of not acting. So what can the law do? So Client Earth, as you may know, we're a charity, we're global, and we use the law to accelerate climate environmental action. And we use the law in different ways. So we enforce the law, holding laggards to account. We work with advocacy and drafting legislation to fill the gaps in legislation and regulation. And importantly, we use the law to set out what good looks like too. So let me take each of those in turn. Firstly, enforcement, and this is the stuff that we normally hit the news for, the way we litigate. There are already legal guardrails across various aspects of the law that compel companies to act, from human rights law to financial regulation to consumer protection law. But it's not enough to have that law in place, of course. It needs to be upheld. So at Client Earth, we litigate to enforce those legal guardrails, to set precedent and to change behaviours. So let me give it as an example, a greenwashing case that we supported recently against KLM, the latest in a great many greenwashing cases we have brought. So we argued that KLM's advertising had misled the public by saying the airline is tackling climate change, despite in fact having plans to increase its flights. The case challenged the aviation industry's reliance on speculative solutions in their climate targets, such as sustainable aviation fuels and offsetting. Now, we won that case, and we didn't just win that case because it's set a major legal precedent. The European Commission is now investigating 20 airlines over potentially misleading greenwashing practices. So that's where you begin to see that systemic shift. And greenwashing litigation is now happening between corporates too, with renewable energy company Iberdrola suing Repsol, fossil fuel energy company, for greenwashing. And Iberdrola tell us that they were inspired by our work at Client Earth. Second trend, I suppose, is that there are changes afoot in fiduciary duties. Now, our case against Shell's board of directors, filed last year, was a world first challenge attempting to hold directors personally liable for mismanaging climate risk. Now, the case was unsuccessful. The UK courts refused to hear the substance of it, but a case like this will win sooner rather than later, and boardrooms around the world sat up and paid attention. And we're seeing elsewhere fiduciary duty cases increasing. Earlier this year, Enea, a Polish energy company, sued its former directors for a coal power investment that went wrong. And of course, it's not just about climate. Biodiversity risk is just as significant, and companies need to manage that too, or they'll also risk legal action. So that's the enforcement. Secondly, how can we strengthen the law to fill those regulatory and legal gaps? So we do that, we engage directly with policymakers and with corporates. And the corporate leaders we speak to say that they want high standards, they want legal clarity to help guide the transition. So there's an enormous amount going on at the EU level, as you'll be talking about today, with new laws requiring companies to set and implement credible 1.5 aligned transition plans to ensure they're not greenwashing, and of course on supply chain integrity and circularity, to name a few. And meanwhile, the UK Labour Party have said that they're considering introducing net zero legislation that compels companies to outline 1.5 aligned transition plans. So change is underway and it's here to stay. So what does good look like? Talked about what bad looks like, how we litigate, how that risk of litigation can change behaviors. What does good look like from a legal perspective? And how can companies manage that climate risk and bridge that ambition gap? So a while back, Client Earth published some principles for Paris-aligned transition strategies to show what looks good from a legal perspective. And we set out 3 key requirements. I'll touch on those briefly. Firstly, they need to be reasonable. That means they need to be science-based with short, medium, and long-term emissions targets. They need to be transparent in terms of their targets, assumptions, uncertainties, methodologies, performance, and impacts. All of that needs to be disclosed in a transparent way. And thirdly, they need to be accountable. So decision makers need to be incentivized and accountable for meeting targets. So with responsibility for meeting emissions reductions targets allocated to particular individuals, part of their roles and responsibilities, and tied to remuneration and performance incentives. So that's what we did on transition planning. More recently, we published guidance on how the seafood and agricultural sector can manage biodiversity risk, because none of this stuff is easy. There isn't a clear path out there. But there are, despite the complexity, there are some great examples of companies who have taken the transition incredibly seriously and gained first mover advantage. The Danish company Ørsted is one. It decided around the 2009 UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen to shift its business from oil and gas to renewable energy. It has transitioned almost completely to becoming a wind energy company, and it's now a global leader in a sector that will power the future. And I know there are many other corporate leaders gathered here today, those who see the transition not as a burden, but as an opportunity. So to pull it together, to conclude, how do we bridge the corporate climate gap between pledges and reality? So the right rules, the right regulations and guidance have a huge role to play, as of course does litigation in enforcing the law, holding laggards to account, changing behaviours. But we don't really want to litigate. What we need is for the corporate world to show the way. We need companies to be bold, to show ambitious leadership, and move beyond that short-term thinking to take the long view, focusing on long-term sustainability for the good of the company, the planet, and future generations. So that means setting and communicating the vision, and then the sustained hard work to turn that vision into reality. And the law should be there to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really fantastic. And I love the way you put that a net zero transition plan isn't just good PR, it's good business. And I'm sure that's something we'll be reflecting on throughout. Thank you very much and good luck in the rest of your time in Madrid. Brilliant. So those are our keynote speeches out of the way. They were a great way to start the day. And now we're going to be moving into a panel discussion on this all important topic of transition planning. I'm going to be moderating this panel, and we've got three really excellent speakers hailing from very different industries, but all working very hard to make their net zero transition plans possible. So I'm going to invite them now to introduce themselves briefly. We have Danielle from the BBC, Benj from Orsted, who just indeed got a shout out from Laura there, and Tillman from Barry Callebaut. So let's have them introduce themselves to you. Danielle, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. Great to be here, by the way. So I'm Danielle Mulder, and I lead sustainability at the BBC.
Thank
Looking
you.
forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks so much for joining. Benj?
Yes, good morning. Great to be here. Ben Sykes from Orsted. Laura, thanks for the shout out. I'll come back to some of your points. I work at Orsted looking after environment and policy.
Thank you. And Tillman, finally.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Tillman from Barry Callebaut. Barry Callebaut is the world's largest chocolate manufacturer, and I am responsible for the strategy and implementation of everything we do around net zero. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So we really wanted to focus this opening plenary panel discussion on how transition planning can help businesses to overcome some of the barriers that they face on the journey to net zero. So the team that I work in at the Carbon Trust actually recently surveyed over 400 large global businesses on this very topic. And one of the top barriers that sustainability decision makers pointed us to was the challenge of making the internal business case for net zero, specifically in relation to aligning net zero with other organizational priorities and growth plans as well. So we know that this is a real challenge and that various factors are influencing professionals' decision-making processes. Some of that was touched on by Chris and Laura, pressure from shareholders, from regulations, from customers. And that businesses sometimes struggle to capture and articulate the long-term value of transitioning to net zero. And in conducting this research, we really felt that transition planning was actually an essential tool for helping to break this business case barrier, because it helps businesses to move beyond a compliance mindset and make that conceptual leap that Laura was talking about, from seeing decarbonisation not just as important, but actually critical to long-term business performance. So that is the topic of discussion today. And Tillman, I wanted to kick off with a question to you. How do you think this process of transition planning can help a business to reconcile its journey to net zero with its broader long-term business objectives?
Great. Let me start by saying some of the things that have been said before really made a lot of sense for me. I think really this point of the difference between setting a target and then taking action, right? That in between part is the transition planning. So it's so important and great that you're putting that focus today. I think very importantly when we talk about this is that we need to change the way we think about business, right? And a good starting point for that is acknowledging that net zero comes, at least in the short term, and at least in the way we used to think about business, it comes as a cost to business, right? So it's not going to, increase in the short term our profitability, and it's not just in the win-win space. So there's a lot we need to anticipate that will, at least in the short term, cost us money, and that's a very important acknowledgement that I think is not an easy one for many companies, right? But I think something to make this more palatable is if this concept of cost of inaction, we heard about this a lot, right? So today is no longer a kind of individual company's decision whether or not a company would like to move towards net zero. It is just a new way, a kind of hygiene factor. It's a license to operate topic. So, and that really helps for companies to make that case. So it's less about, do we want to invest that money? It's more like, how do we navigate those new circumstances that our company is now in, and all those different expectations. We heard it from government, from consumers. We heard about legal risk, etc. So how do we? Those are there and they won't go away. So how do you navigate that the best way? So you're basically starting from the point, okay, there is something happening. There is a cost coming towards us. How do you navigate this? And then I said we need to change the way we think about business. And there are two important angles. One is that we think more long term, so we just have to expand the time horizons of what we always often think is the time horizons for analysis and coming to decisions. And secondly, we just need to also broaden it. We need to assess new types of risks that in the past we haven't thought about. And a couple of those points that we need to newly address, we already heard, right? New risks, physical climate risks, super important. I can talk more about this if you like later as a agricultural company, regulatory, legal, reputational, etc. Those are risks which in the past haven't really existed. So how do we factor them into our decision making? And for this, we first need to analyze this. TCFD is very important in this. So one of the advices already would be, when you do transition planning, do your risk side, definitely include your risk side, not just your mitigation side. But also not just talking about risk. I mean, yes, there's a net cost, but there are definitely parts into transition which can have, in the short term, traditional business thinking can be a real business opportunity, right? We should not overlook them either, right? There are new, for example, the new products which are just now, haven't been competitive in the market for a long time, but now they are, right? Think about plant-based, think about e-mobility. So the ones who are quickest in getting engaged, they will be the winners on the marketplace. So definitely big opportunities. Also, I think an interesting field to look into is everything around employee engagement and purpose. Employees today have very high expectations for employers to get engaged in climate change, right? And not stay on the reactive, on the laggard side. So in what sense does it help us as a company to be an attractive employer, to attract and retain talent, if you're proactive on climate change? That's something which we haven't thought about in the past, and I guess most companies haven't thought about it. But today it's a material and it's a business topic.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Sorry, Tom.
good.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. That I think that was really great place to start, and I really like the way you framed it, that transition planning kind of forces us to change the way businesses think, to think more long term and think about a whole new catalogue of risks really differently, as well as the opportunities. And I expect you all work in very different sectors. That's those risks and those long term horizons are going to look different for all of you. And in the UK, we had the transition plan task force thinking about this from a sector led perspective. And they have published a wealth of information on transition planning for those different sectors. And I want to dive now into how the transition to net zero looks a bit differently for the sectors you work in. And Benj, I think it would be great to start with you. I mean, Ørsted lives and breathes the energy transition. So what does transition planning look like for an organization like that?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. And I'm going to pick up on a lot of what Tillman shared. And again, Laura, thanks for the shout out. For those of you that don't know us, we're the world's biggest offshore wind developer, but we're also doing a lot of other renewables, e-fuels, hydrogen, storage, and trying to power the whole green transition in the power sector. We, as Laura said, made this big decision coming out of Paris, but ultimately in 2017, we used to be called Dong Energy, Danish Oil and Natural Gas, and we pivoted entirely to a renewables play and a clean energy play. And to Tillman's point, a big factor in that was looking ahead. And we talk about long-term planning, but actually I think it's starting with what does the future really look like for our sector? Let's imagine what our business needs to look like in 2030, 2035, 2040. Because there is an existential threat to fossil fuel industry. We spotted that and we took the action to entirely pivot away. Our business, our sector is entirely driven by tackling climate change. So it's perhaps a hard one to relate to in terms of transition planning, because that is the whole purpose of our business. But I wanted to maybe just touch on turning ambition into action, because our business isn't just about decarbonising the power sector. It's also about decarbonising our business activities. And I guess that's where we can focus this morning. We have our own transition plan. I think we're the world's first energy company to have an SBTi approved set of targets. And I think the point around target setting, validation, external validation is absolutely critical. Regulation is our friend, not our enemy in this. We need to see the right protocols coming in nationally and transnationally if we're going to drive this into every sector. So we've set an ambition of 98% reduction of scope 1 and 2 by next year. actually, and we're at 92% there already, and Scope 1 to 3 by 2040. So we're really focusing on very tangible transition plans for our supply chains. In particular, we know, for example, that 33% of our business emissions come from our vessels, whether that's the steel that goes into them or the fuel that powers them, almost 30% from the wind turbines that we install and operate, 20% from foundation. So we've set up a very comprehensive program with our supply chain to help our supply chain transition, because we can see we need to drive the carbon out of our supply chain, as well as delivering decarbonisation of the power system itself. So things like working with steel producers on green steel. I'll come back maybe a bit later on some of the environmental aspects that we're driving. Great, Laura, that you mentioned biodiversity. It is at least as big a threat to the planet as climate change, and the two, of course, very closely interwoven. But I would say Carbon Trust, Ørsted's drive is really around working in partnership with our supply chain. And why do they want to work with us? Why do we want to make the complexity now in our supply chains? It's because we can see regulation is coming. In fact, it's coming next year in the UK, for example, for offshore wind, with sustainable industry rewards, having to demonstrate that we are working with SBTi compliant businesses in our supply chain, for example. And what we see is that if we get on the front foot on this, if we take action sooner than our competitors, it will give us a business advantage. It's an investment now, but it absolutely will deliver a return. We've seen that in the way in which we've delivered our very large portfolio of offshore wind around the world, but we can see that coming through the supply chain as well. So I think for me, just to sort of circle it round again, it really does come back to recognizing that there is a first mover advantage in terms of having a transition plan in the supply chains, in the business, that enables us to compete and outcompete when it comes to others who are trying to deliver the same energy transition. We're a business, we want to be better than the competition. I think at the moment we probably are. We had a few wrinkles last year, but ultimately we can see that the way we're investing and partnering with the supply chain right across the world in every aspect of our business is going to give us that competitive advantage, because we can see by 2030, 2035, nobody's going to be building renewable energy without having clean supply chains. I'm going to leave it there because there's lots more to talk about.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, fascinating to hear about that experience of Ørsted completely shifting its business model because it thought about what the sector would look like in the future and kind of work back from there. And I think that's something that we can all take inspiration from and learn from. Danielle, now I'd love to hear more about the approach of the BBC, and coming back to the question that we're trying to answer here in this panel, how does transition planning help to make the internal business case for net zero? I wanted to know how you've made the case for net zero at the BBC and how you've used some of the principles of transition planning to really put net zero at the heart of the BBC's future.
Yeah, no problem at all. So we've been our own journey. I think that's what happens in companies, isn't it? From the sort of realization that, you know, this is a requirement and that it's serious, and now it's maturing onto sort of a regulatory requirement. So I think we've kind of, if we think about this in terms of the what, the why, and the how, we're no longer in the kind of, you know, the what is net zero, but there was lots of conversations, particularly at senior level, about what net zero actually means. You know, what does good look like? What's a credible net zero definition or position that the BBC should be taking? And our view is that less of the net and more of the zero is the BBC's position. So, which is why we talk about this topic in deep decarbonisation and actually getting rid of the emissions at source and permanently, rather than having a reliance on offsetting. So the what, if you like, is settled. We have to do it. It's written into law. Hopefully the Climate Change Act and the businesses need to respond to that, and we're now regulated. Yeah. In how we meet net zero and now what our plan is to achieve net zero. The why as well, we understand the why. We did actually deliver some training for all of our senior staff, for the board and for ExCo members as well, to really understand, to really increase that sort of eco-literacy across the BBC. and settle the science in terms of, what is the scientific evidence for this, and why is this important, and why is it in the public interest, particularly for the BBC in our role as a media organisation, to tell our audiences about this and to inform them and educate them on the topic and what's coming. Yeah. So the sort of what and the why is settled, if you like. So we're now into the how. We've also got science-based targets as well. So we've got a very clear position on what credible net zero looks like as an organisation. And we're now into the sort of like, right, let's get to it. Well, how are we going to deliver this, the transition plan? And I think the framework's pretty good, actually, in terms of setting out organisations need to bring to life, what the ambition is, what the actions are, and also the accountability in terms of how it's structured and the elements to that plan. And also having consistency in that framework is quite helpful, because then you can start to compare, can't you, within sectors, but also, different companies against each other in terms of how they respond to this and what their actual plan is to deliver net zero. So that's kind of where we are. And look, I think it's about taking this to the top table. You've got to take it to the board. They need to own the plan. And that is critical for this being taken seriously and for this being, the ability to deliver against this, because it can't be a sideshow. It's not annoying. We've got this thing called net zero we've now got to deliver against. It needs to be absolutely integral to the organisational business strategy. And it's also been interesting having that conversation with the board and with the executive committee at the BBC, because there was definitely a going in position that this is annoying and that this is going to cost more money for the organisation. But actually, when we ran the numbers, we actually could sort of debunk that myth. Because particularly when you look at scope 1 and 2, for example, we were asked to come back, the sustainability team was asked to come back working with finance, the business case for this. And that's key to this transition plan, by the way. It's the money, it's the how, it's the initiatives, it's the strategies and how they're going to be funded. The solutions are there for delivering net zero, and particularly your direct operational emissions. They're all there. So we could, take our 225 buildings, look across, because it's a global remit that I run in terms of all of our internationals, but also our public service and commercial operations as well. And actually, for an organisation that has an annual turnover of between 5.6 and 5.7 billion, and I have talked about these numbers before, we determined that to implement what's necessary to achieve our halving our emissions by 2030, so a business case to 2030, we would require an investment of 36.4 million, to implement the heat pumps and the transition to the EV fleets, for degasification, for optimizing our diesel usage across all of our productions, because we use a lot of diesel at the moment, and we're actually starting to transition rapidly away from that. 36.4 million, but actually delivered a cost saving by 2030 of 55.8 million. So that changed the conversation, and you can go into the room with a lot of confidence and say, look, guys, I know there's a capex investment that needs to happen up front, and that is more about affordability and how we're going to finance that. There's a very clear business case to doing this and getting ahead of this. And delivering it. And I think once you win that argument, make that very, very clear, you're no longer negotiating, and it becomes very integral to the overall strategy of the organisation.
Yeah.
But particularly, I think, just lastly, particularly for the BBC, the opportunity for the BBC is about using our voice in this conversation, showcasing what we're doing, not just for the media organisation and media industry, but also for our audiences as well, and informing and educating on the topic. And that's why we've actually attached it firmly to what we call our value for all strategy. So we have priorities within that, and the big one for us is pursuit of the truth with no agenda. And climate change fits very neatly under that priority. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating to hear about how you've helped the board to kind of have that mindset switch from seeing this as a problem and something at the side of the organization to really at the heart. So thank you so much for sharing that experience. I know that early on in the panel discussion, we talked a little bit about nature, and biodiversity is something, of course, that Laura picked up on as well. And Tilman, this must be so important for you, and for Barry Callebaut's global supply chains. I mean, they need to have a really considered approach, not just to climate, but to nature as well. And we know that finally these two are being talked about in the same sentence, nature and climate. And so I wanted to ask you about how you approach the process of transition planning to account for risks and opportunities related to both nature and climate for Barry Callebaut.
Right. Yeah, it's super, super important, right? We are B2B chocolate manufacturer, but we are vertically integrated, means we're really buying a lot of cocoa and then all the other ingredients that you need for the chocolate we all love, right? So, and as most of our peers in the same, ag food industry, we are very, very dependent on well-functioning ecosystems. Both on farm, we need healthy soils, but also at the landscape, right? So we need healthy ecosystems close by our farms that are important then for us to have pollinators and have fresh water supply, et cetera, et cetera. So for better and worse, you could say we are very, very dependent. So that means on the kind of better side, I think nature has often been seen, and there's a lot about that, as a quite cost-effective solution to reducing emissions or removing emissions from the atmosphere, right? So in that sense, we are lucky because we are, and integrated into our value chain is a relatively cost-effective solution. But on the other side, I think we are also as an industry among the very first, since nature is so vulnerable, to feel the impacts of climate change. And we are seeing this already today. And I think that's really a particularity about our sector. Now, what we can do is luckily a lot of these kind of nature-based solutions have synergies on both the mitigation side, they remove or reduce emissions, but also to help to adapt to climate change. And for us, the most important one that we've been driving quite a lot is agroforestry. So we're introducing non-cocoa shade trees to cocoa farms, which remove CO2 from the atmosphere. That's something we can quantify. At the same time, they also help to increase shade, right, to a certain level. So we have to design it in the right way. But it helps to make farming more resilient. So that means whenever there's the next kind of heat wave or period of drought, we can help our farmers to become, to have a more resilient cocoa yield throughout that. So, and that's really the magic of nature-based solutions that we can play. So it really helps us to reduce our risk, right? And then, as what I said before, when we had this broader perspective, we are starting to having climate risk much more on the agenda right now. This is now physical climate risk, right? Link over to TCFD and agroforestry and other things, also regenerative agriculture, etc., have those kind of dual impact. And that's really, really helpful for the business case. So we're really driving that, and we're doing that wherever we can together with our customers, because collaboration around across the value chain is very important, and we can then all across the sector vertically from where we are upstream all the way to brands and retailers work together to have A, reduce emissions, and B, become more resilient towards climate change.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I completely agree. Resilience has to be at the heart of this, at the heart of any transition planning. It's not just the mitigation, it's building in resilience for your future business as well. So thanks for sharing that. Sticking on the theme of resilience, Benj, you touched earlier on about how the future of the offshore wind industry needs to be clean itself. It needs to have net zero aligned supply chains, processes, materials. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about how Ørsted has been tackling this challenge while also scaling up offshore wind deployment.
Yeah, absolutely. And come back to Tilman's point, one of the biggest drivers of the biodiversity crisis is, of course, climate change itself. So we definitely need to tackle the two in concert. I talked earlier about the need for engaging with supply chains, because that gives us ultimately a competitive advantage. And I don't believe that's true only of my sector. I think that is going to be true of many sectors. I think the same perhaps to a lesser extent at the moment, but it is coming, is the need to be competitive around tackling biodiversity loss, because regulation is coming. Again, we see in the UK that marine net gain is going to become a requirement very soon. So there's no doubt that as a business, we need to put a program in place to make sure that we're able to meet and outcompete on this particular parameter. We know offshore wind is one of the main tools for tackling climate change in the power system. But we also know that, like every other piece of infrastructure, offshore wind, building large power stations in the sea inevitably has environmental impacts. And these are big assets we're building. Just to put it in context, the one we most recently built in the UK has about the same output as a nuclear power station. So these are big power plants. How do we tackle the biodiversity impacts, the environmental impacts? Well, we do a lot through the mitigation hierarchy, of course, to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. But we've made a very public statement that our ambition is that from 2030, all of our projects, onshore and offshore, will have a net positive biodiversity impact. We want to make sure that as we build out offshore wind and onshore wind and other infrastructure, that we leave the environment in a better state than we find it. It's the right thing to do, but it is also good for our business. And the reason for that is if we're doing the right things around nature, doing the right things around biodiversity impacts and solving some of the problems that climate change and other human activities are driving, it gives us a competitive advantage. Offshore wind is going to have to build something like 2,000 gigawatts out to 2050. The number may not mean much, but we're talking about sort of $5 trillion of investment. And our hope is that through the leadership that we're doing here, we can make sure that a fraction of that money is invested in biodiversity solutions. There's a lot of this hinges on data, very challenging in the marine environment in particular. And so it's great to be working across industry. It's not just about Ørsted, it's also about collaborating across industry. For example, on the Carbon Trust Zone Offshore Wind Sustainability Joint Industry Programme, which we're part of. Really important piece of the puzzle for us to understand the data we need, how we use the data. But to bring it full circle, I think we've talked a lot about tackling climate change. We've talked a lot about having transition plans that can meaningfully deliver that. I think looking forward, we absolutely can see that the same challenge is going to come to every industry, every sector, on our environmental credentials, our biodiversity credentials. And again, investing early, working with your supply chains, working with your competitors as well to find solutions will give us a pathway to growth and sustainable return. So for Ørsted, we're fully committed not just to decarbonising, but also to tackling this biodiversity loss that we see around the globe.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Great to hear about that. Very exciting developments. Danielle, we need to wrap up this panel, but I would love to give the final word to you very briefly. I wondered, could we end with your sense of what your key message would be for businesses here today who are navigating their own transition planning process?
Yeah, no problem at all. I think it really is about getting this at the top table as quickly as you can. That's not always easy, but in terms of it, you really can't have a transition plan, a credible transition plan, that isn't fully integrated into your strategy, into your corporate ambition, your mission, in terms of the actions that you're going to take. It needs to be fully costed as well, with that business case that I outlined, the BBC example earlier, but also the governance and the accountability about where this sits in the organisation and who's the ultimate sort of owner of net zero within the organisation. I also wanted to just touch on a little bit about the use of our programming, and so we're very lucky. We have brilliant audience monitoring team, so we survey our audiences all the time on different topics, but we also include in that conversations and surveys around climate change, and particularly the BBC is famous for its nature programming. Yeah, so we have been running impact research against some of the natural history unit output, in particular Green Planet, and more recently the Wild Isles programme that was around the UK. Yeah, and those insights are proving really valuable, not just for our audiences and how we have this conversation and how we activate and inspire change on this topic about what people need to do to contribute to the topic on climate change, but it also helps our staff within our engagement with our staff, with our suppliers, our supply chain, and our partners as well. So we're very sort of fortunate in that. But I mean, I think to go to your question, really it is about the what and the why. In my opinion, is now settled. It should be in all organisations. We are regulated on this, and it's sort of, the regulation has really, cranking in now and really starting to bite. So it's about that how and making it specific to your organisation and business, and you have to integrate that to your overarching business strategy. You can't not do that, and I think Tillman and Benj outlined that very, very well, actually, in terms of it absolutely needs to be shaped to your organisation business and the challenges that you face to be a sustainable business in the future. So
Absolutely. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much. Great note to end on, and thank you so much to your fellow panelists, Tillman and Benj. Thank you for your time. So that is nearly it for the plenary session. It's the end of my time with you. So just to say good luck with the rest of the day. I hope you find it useful. So it's my pleasure to be handing over to Managing Director of Business Services here at the Carbon Trust, Hugh Jones, for some final reflections on this morning's plenary session before we ask you to move on to the sector stages. Hugh, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nina. And of course, big thank you to our excellent plenary panel for the reflections today. It was really interesting to hear the comments from the panel on transition planning and on the rigor that needs to go into that, but also on the making the case internally. And of course, at the end there, on the very strong links between carbon, climate change and biodiversity. And in particular, we heard from Tillman about risk, actually, but also about resilience and the importance of nature-based solutions such as agroforestry in Barry Callebaut's case. Benj talked eloquently about long-term planning and the absolute need to green the supply chain, to have a clean supply chain, and indeed to make sure there are biodiversity benefits as well. And then Danielle, on behalf of the BBC, well, she started by saying very eloquently again that it was more about the zero than the net, i.e. the decarbonisation agenda, but also the importance of getting this to the top table. And we heard really about, and this is true of all the organisations we've heard from, making this chime with the opportunity space, what's relevant to the individual organisation, because that's what's going to get leadership on board and indeed staff, and ultimately link transition to business strategy. So it was really great to hear from all of you. And before that, we had some really key messages from Laura Clark. The one I took away most from that was accountability, both under the law, but also the duty of business to deliver robust, transparent transition plans, which they will be accountable for. And then before that, our new CEO, Chris Stark, who made a number of excellent points. And the one I most remember is he asked you in the room to be strong champions in business for decarbonisation. And I think we know that many of you already are, but that's a really great message. So now we're going to move on to the bit where you get to choose a stage to attend. And these stages, they're actually based on the industry sectors, but each one is packed with expertise and relevance for anybody, actually, regardless of the sector you're in. And we have 9 more great panelists. And these are all from organizations that the Carbon Trust works closely with. And because of the knowledge we have and the work that we've done with these companies, we know that the sessions will be rich with content. And I just wanted to make a point before I introduce the 3 stages, that the connection between businesses and Carbon Trust here is really, really important. So not just the 9 who are represented on the stage panels, but there are many others of you in the virtual room today who work with us. And of course, there are a number of you who don't yet work with us, who are curious perhaps. So I just wanted to say, echoing what Chris Stark said earlier, the Carbon Trust, it's important that you know that we work all around the world with a really unique blend of different constituencies. So not just corporates, which is the main focus of today, but also government, finance, specialist technology providers. That's really important, and we occupy that kind of space spanning all of those different types of organization. And the business services team, which Nina just mentioned, that's the one which I lead, and it's an expert team based in London, Amsterdam, and now Berlin, but again operating globally and providing strategic and technical climate and carbon advice. And that team could assure your numbers and your claims as well, which is highly relevant given the talk earlier about green hushing and about the importance of robust information being put out there. And we work across a broad range of industry sectors. So going forward, the team would be really happy to discuss solutions, whether it is focused on transition planning and decarbonisation, strategy, climate risk itself, carbon labelling, CSRD, the whole range. So time now to move on to the stages. I will quickly mention them. They should be on your agendas as well. We have the agriculture, food and drink stage, which is focusing strongly on the opportunity space around decarbonisation, and that features Glanbia, Greggs and DP World, and it's led by my colleagues Tom Cumberledge and Isabel Divana. We have the manufacturing stage, which has a particular focus on Scope 3, featuring GSK, River Island and Leo Pharma, and that's led by my colleagues Christine Davis and Anna Raffaelli from our Germany office. And then thirdly, we have the infrastructure stage. The infrastructure stage is focusing on how that drives transition planning, featuring Nokia, Taylor Wimpey and Iberdrola, and led by Bob Burgoyne and Ellen Smith-Gillespie from the Carbon Trust. You may already have indicated a preference, but please feel free to join any of those three stages, and you can even move between them as they progress. We will aim to finish the three sessions shortly after 12:30 Central European time, 11:30 UK time, and we will end the conference at that point. We won't be coming back here. You will finish the stages and you'll be free to go. On behalf of the Carbon Trust, wanted to thank you very much for your attendance up till now, and please do stay and enjoy these stage sessions. Thank you.